Hello everybody and welcome to the HR Essentials Do You Know What They Are webinar being put together for you today by the Proven Group and Sky Accountants. Few business owners would call themselves accounting, IT or marketing experts, so outsourcing these functions is quite common. Why then do businesses continue to struggle with the headache of HR, often to the detriment of their business and their staff? It's a very good question, and it's one I'm going to pass you over to Belinda Fife from the Proven Group to have a chat about.
Okay. HR Essentials, do you know what they are? So as I said, my name's Belinda Fife and I'll be your facilitator today. I've been working in the human resources space for probably the last 25 years or so. I started out in the manufacturing area and worked within corporates in that sort of area. I've done some work in retail pharmacies and I've also worked for local councils. So I've had quite a diverse, I suppose, experience working in the human resources field. And then about 13 years ago, we started working with small to medium businesses in human resources and specifically as a outsourced HR manager, I suppose, because small to medium businesses with staff still have HR issues and things that need to be addressed, but they don't necessarily have them every day of the week. So they need somebody that they can call on, an expert that they can call on, but not necessarily somebody there all the time. So today, what does HR actually cover? There's quite a few things that human resources covers, and the first one and the most obvious one, I suppose, is that human resource management is people management. Human resource, for some reason, we like to call people a resource within an organisation, which I've always found a little bit strange, but it's basically people management. And any business owner will tell you that if it wasn't for customers and staff, they'd have a really easy business to run. But unfortunately, they probably wouldn't have much business either. So what we're talking about here with human resources management is our people management. And largely this is around staff management is what we're talking about here. So how to get the most out of our people. It's a resource that we pay for the same as we pay for any other resource in a business. And so having some skills around this area can be really profitable for the business. So it's a key thing for us to have a look at. But unfortunately, people are fairly complex creatures. Don't know if this has been your experience, but it's certainly been mine. People are a little bit complicated. They have past experiences, heaps of different expectations. They hear different messages when you say the same thing to people, and they have this thing called baggage that they bring along with them. Because they're human beings, they're not automatons. Things happen in their lives, and that will impact on how they are at work, what their behaviours are like, and all of that sort of thing. I had a team once who were really interesting on this baggage. The team in a team building exercise actually decided that they would create a baggage basket, is what they called it. So they put a physical basket by the front door as they walked in, and the idea was that as they all got to work every day, they were going to put their baggage in the basket, the stuff that was happening at home that was, you know, potentially worrying them or whatever. So they'd have this shake off as they walked in, put it in the baggage basket, and then get on with work. That worked really well for them, but I think the reason it worked really well from them was because it came from the team. It didn't come from management. It wasn't the owner's idea. It was the team who were actually saying, you know what, in order for us to work better together, let's see if we can leave some of these things behind. So I just thought that was always a really good story. HR also covers any and all workplace behaviours, so good and bad. So this is, you know, all your teamwork stuff, any interactions people have with each other, any words that they say to each other, any gestures that they make to each other, any activity that they're actually involved in. So it's pretty far-reaching when you think about it. It's anything and everything that people are involved with in the workplace. It's communication, and communication is a massive topic on its own, obviously, and I've never actually worked with any team who has said, oh, no, it's okay, we get communicated to enough, I get told exactly what I need to know, when I need to know it, it's all good here. You know, you don't have to worry about that. No team I've ever worked with has said that. Communication is something that you can't overdo, and particularly in the current situation, one of the things that I've been saying to my clients throughout this current pandemic and what the impacts that it's had and the fast changing environment we've had is just communicate with your team. If you don't know the answer to something, say you don't know. you're human. People will have to forgive you for that. It's about keeping those communication lines open. So any communication with your team and any communication between team members is also covered by HR. Culture is a really big one, and particularly its impact on the bottom line. So one of the things that we talk about a lot with our clients is how much the culture actually impacts. So the culture is the feel or the vibe of the place. So what does it actually feel like to work here? How do I, what's it like when somebody new starts in the business? What's it like when somebody leaves the business? So every time we have a new team member or somebody leave the business, the culture will change subtly, because really the culture is something that is built every day. So it's different every day, potentially, is what we're coming at there. The biggest impactor on culture, of course, is behaviours in the workplace. But culture will then impact on how much discretionary effort somebody wants to put into their job. So this is the going above and beyond, going the extra mile. What is it that I actually want to add, to my role, going above what's actually required in the role. And of course, if you have a team that goes above and beyond constantly, that's going to be better for your bottom line. So there has this direct impact between behaviours and cultures in the organisation and that bottom line. The good news there is that the biggest impactor on behaviours in a business is values. And this is something that we talk about a lot, and I know we've got an information session coming up on this in a few months. But values are something that organisations, particularly large organisations, will spend a bit of time on, and they'll write up very pretty posters and put them on their front wall, and they'll have them on their website, and they'll say, here's what the values are in our organisation. But unfortunately, they forget to tell their team. And if people don't understand what the values are, they can't live the values. So if they are something that's real to the business, they should be impacting on the behaviours, which impacts on the culture, which impacts on the effort, which impacts on the bottom line. My controversial one for the day here: staff are not your friends. This is a really interesting one, and it's because I have what's going around in my mind at the moment is a manager that I worked with many years ago in the retail pharmacy area. She ran a front of shop team of about 30 staff. It was a 9 to 9, 7-day-a-week pharmacy. It was a big operation, and she would say this all the time: staff are not your friends. I don't go out for drinks with you because tomorrow I might need to pull you up on something and tell you it's not on, and or I might need to sack you down the track. So the idea here is that you can absolutely have a friendly relationship with your staff, and I would encourage that. We need to have their best interests at heart, because the employer needs the staff member needs the employer. It's a mutual need relationship, and we need to be respectful of that by all means. But they're not necessarily people that you would tell your deepest and darkest secrets to, is probably what I'm saying here. Bear in mind that it's not an equal relationship, and staff, you really shouldn't be looking for personal friendships in your staff base. HR also covers any issues regarding industrial relations. So in Australia here, that of course impacts through the Fair Work Act, which is the Commonwealth Act. By the way, Fair Work's 10 years old this year, so it's been around for a while. Of course, the modern award structure that we have here in Australia is also part of the Fair Work Act, as are the National Employment Standards. Any contracts of employment, which are an agreement between you and your individual staff member, that is a private arrangement, so they don't get sent to Fair Work or anything. It's just a common law contract. And any enterprise bargaining agreements, which are a collective agreement made between the staff as a whole and the employer. Now, EBAs normally have a time frame on them, 2 or 3 years. Contracts of employment are ongoing. So one of the things here that people don't necessarily understand very well is that the Fair Work Act has the National Employment Standards, which are the 10 minimum standards of employment in Australia. They're all the things that you can't write out of a contract, even by agreement. So things like 4 weeks annual leave per year, 10 days personal leave per year, a 38-hour week, that kind of thing. So that forms the foundation of our industrial relations framework here in Australia. What sits on top of that then is the award structure. So if you have an employee that fits under an award structure, then you're held to that award. It's a legal document, and you have to be held to that award. Unless there's an EBA, the EBA actually replaces an award, and a lot of people don't necessarily understand that. And then on top of that sits a contract of employment. So if you do have an individual contract of employment, which we would always recommend, because that gives you some flexibility around the employment arrangement, you need to read that in conjunction with the award and in conjunction with the National Employment Standards. So there's a fair amount of layered complexity in our industrial relations system. I wish I could say, sorry about that, but it's there for a reason. It's grown up historically over time to give protections to the employer and the employee. HR also covers role clarity. This is a massive, massive one I find in organisations all the time. Confusion is one of the biggest issues that most organisations suffer from. Part of that's a communication issue, but part of it's also just a misunderstanding around boundaries and abilities. So what is it that I can do? What is it that I'm not allowed to do? And what do I need to change, moving forward? So role clarity, it's the manager's job or the owner's job in the business to provide that role clarity. It's not the employee's job. So this is, again, probably a bit controversial for some people, but that's one of the key things as managers that we need to do, is to be absolutely clear with people what their role is, what the expectations are, what the deadlines are. Training is also covered under human resources, as are things like reviews and feedback. So feedback, again, is not necessarily something that we do terribly well in Australia. We don't like to tell people that that they're doing extremely well, because that's tall poppy syndrome and we can't possibly have that. And we don't like to tell them when they're not performing, because that's a difficult conversation and we just don't, it's unpleasant and we don't like doing that. So what we end up with then is lots of mediocre, average, kind of in the middle, and that's not what we want either. So you can see from that list there, and this is just a list that I wrote straight off the top of my head, and to be honest, there's probably a bunch of other things that I haven't got on here. But it's a very wide, broad kind of area. When you're talking people management, it's anything and everything in relation to those, to that people management stuff. Anything from culture, values, organisations, to all of the legal framework. Speaking about the legal framework and the compliance factor, there's lots and lots of legislation out there. We touched on the Fair Work Act on the previous slide, but there's also things like the Equal Opportunity Act. Now, that's a state act. Again, in Australia here, we've got quite a complicated legal system. So there's some stuff is Commonwealth-based, some stuff is state-based. If your business has more than one office or function in different states, you need to be across the different legislation in the different states, because there's differences there. Even the Occupational Health and Safety Act is a state-based act, and that moved to a federal-based thing after Fair Work moved to federal, but Victoria is still on the Victorian Act, just to keep it confusing for everyone. And things like, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, the Age Discrimination Act, and all the things to do with the Australian Human Rights Commission are all things that, even if you only have one staff member in your business, if you actually have an employee, then you have duties under all of these acts. So there's quite a lot here that you need to keep across and keep abreast of as the owner of a business. But of course, it's not your core business. It's not the thing that you're actually in business to do. It may not be your specialty. And like so many other things, there are people like us around that can help you with this sort of stuff if and when you need that. And now, here's a bit of a revolutionary idea. Did you know that you can actually plan for human resources management? I know, it's a bit of an out there one, isn't it? So many people wait until there's a crisis or an issue with human resources before they decide that they need to do something about it. And although that's, that's when there's a pain point, that's when there's something to do, it's actually a lot easier to handle before the crisis situation actually arises. And so we can actually plan for HR management. That's an important part of what we can say here. This is an example of a human resources plan. I run these with clients all the time. So this is where a client is large enough that they need some ongoing HR help, but they don't need somebody there every day, basically. So, and it's split up here into 5 different sections. The first 3 sections are all to do with that compliance stuff that we were just talking about. So legislation, policies and procedures, contracts of employment, position descriptions, performance reviews, disciplinary action, all of that kind of thing. So this is about having an understanding of, well, what are the systems that we need to implement in the business to be able to deliver on this stuff in a timely fashion and in a low hassle kind of fashion. The last two sections here on performance coaching and workplace improvement is really more looking at that sort of cultural side of things and training side of things. So how do we make things better in the organisation? So it looks more at that organisational development stuff rather than just what we'd refer to as the nuts and bolts HR, processing, legal compliance sort of thing. As a general rule with this kind of thing, for an outsourced HR manager, it depends on the size of the business. How much time they're going to need depends on the size of the business, and it roughly correlates to 1 day per staff member per year, just as a rough guide for people. So where do you start with HR when you're starting to look? Because, it's a massive, massive area, and I don't want to overwhelm people with that today, but I just want to sort of give you a bit of an overview. I would start with a HR audit because most businesses are usually doing something right in this area. So that's the good news. You are probably doing something right. Great. But what is that? So if we do a HR audit on, well, what are our current systems that are in place? Are they working well for us? Are they something that we can improve on and systemize more so that we can get better results from that as we go along? So things, for instance, around recruitment, like interview guides, reference check forms. So for each of the roles that we actually have in the business, do we have a written position description for that role? Does that role then have an interview guide for it so that if and when we need to recruit for that role, we're right to go? And do we have a reference check form for that as well so that we know that we're asking referees the right questions around that role to be sure that we're going to choose a good candidate? Do we then have our contracts of employment in place, a legislative compliance system? As I said, there was just, I just had a slide up with a number of acts on it, but really that's, again, just a taster of the ones that are out there. So do we have an annual process where we look at, well, are all of our policies and things up to date? What's changed out there, recently? What do we need to update to be on top of all that sort of stuff? So there's a lot of things here that we would look at and sort of say, okay, you've got something on that and it works really well. And if it works really well, great, let's not reinvent the wheel. Keep doing what you're doing. Oftentimes in businesses, when I run a HR audit, it takes me about a day, and we look at all of these different things. I'll look at a lot of documents and I'll write a report around, well, okay, you've got this, it works really well, let's not fix it. You've got this, it works okay, but we could improve it with something else. Or there's a gap here and it's mandatory and you need to do something about it. Or here's a potential gap, but it's really your choice whether you want to do anything on it or not. Because if it's not a legal compliance issue, it's then a question for the employer. Do they see value in that or not? And that's up to them. I also just wanted to touch base on the legislative compliance bit again. So policies and procedures in HR are really important, and I can't overemphasize these, and I do have a little story to share with you on one of these. So this is a list of the 14 mandatory policies and procedures that we recommend for every client that has a staff member. So even if you only have one staff member, we would recommend that you put in place these 14 policies and procedures. How many HR policies and procedures are there? Well, how long's a piece of string? It really depends on your business and what's available. I've got a list of another 80 that we could choose from, but from that I've actually said, okay, what are the ones that are really important to have from a legal perspective so that you can then manage the people well within your business? So things like your equal opportunity policy, anti-discrimination, harassment and bullying are really, really important. So these are hot topics and ones that businesses have obligations under the OH&S Act, but also under the Fair Work Act for bullying and under the Equal Opportunity Act for harassment and discrimination. So businesses need to know, well, what is it that's actually covered and what's not? From a discrimination perspective, and look, the word discrimination gets a bad rap because we've got this act called the Anti-Discrimination Act. But discriminating just means making a decision. So I often say to people, when you go out and buy your lunch, you're going to, if you buy a pie, then you've discriminated against the salad roll. Like, that's what discriminates. So you're just making a decision about something. The key thing that we need to know is that there are certain attributes under the Anti-Discrimination Act that are protected. So you can't make the decision based on that attribute. So things like age, gender, religion, political status, political affiliation, that sort of thing. So understanding what that is there is really important. An example of that, many years ago when I worked in the retail pharmacy industry, I remember I interviewed for a job, and of course the anti-discrimination stuff relates to recruitment, so you can't make a decision based on one of those attributes. And one of the attributes is physical features that the person can't help. And I had a girl turn up for the interview. She was a young girl. It was a casual job. So she was going for her first job, teenager. She turned up with green hair and, you know, facial piercings and stuff. But to be honest, I really liked her. I thought she was the best person for the job. She had the right personality, that sort of outgoing sort of thing to do. So when I rang her up and said, look, I'd really like to offer you the job, but there's a couple of conditions. I need you to dye your hair a natural colour, and I need you to remove your piercings when you're at work. Now, looking at that on face value, they were physical attributes that she had, but they were physical attributes that she could control. And because she could control them and change them quite easily, it's not discriminatory under the Act. However, if I'd said to her, you've got a limp or a lisp and therefore you can't get the role, well, that would have been discriminatory under the Act for physical features. So things like there's little nuances with this stuff that sometimes you just need to talk to somebody about to really understand. The other one I'm going to point out here is number 14, which is the social media policy. I talked to lots of employees about this, and I had a phone call last week from a new employer who rang me and said, I've just had one of our staff, they only had 6 staff, one of our staff has just put up a post on his personal Facebook page and bagged out the business, basically. So, you know, the first question to me is usually, can we sack them? And I said, well, no, because that would be harsh and unreasonable in the circumstances. However, you can obviously talk to him about it, pull him up on it and give him a written warning about it. However, they didn't have a policy in place. They'd never communicated to their staff that their expectation was that they wouldn't bag them out on social media. Now, most people will look at that and say, yeah, but isn't that just common sense? Everyone would expect that you wouldn't do that to your employer. And although there's a bit of truth in that, it's not a defence legally, basically. So your policies and procedures are about legal process. And so the reason you have them in place is you write them, and then importantly, you've got to communicate them with your staff, and you've got to have some evidence that you've communicated them with your staff, which is usually a signed meeting sheet to say, yes, we've been through all the policies today, and that goes on each person's personnel file. Then you've got some grounds to stand on when somebody breaches one of these policies, which is what this fellow would have done by saying derogatory things about his employer on his Facebook page. But so it's much easier to pull people up on behaviours that are inappropriate in the workplace if you've been clear with them in the first place about what it is that is appropriate and what's not. I often say common sense isn't that common, so you can't necessarily just rely on that in workplaces. And HR, I've said this for years, HR is a little bit like insurance. So as we know, insurance, most people don't think about very much. And until we need to make a claim, it's often something that we grizzle about as well. So, oh, do I really have to do that? You know, it's a lot of money and all that kind of thing. Insurance is something that you hope you never need, but when you do need it, you're awfully glad that you've got it. And HR is a little bit the same. It's not something that until there is an issue, you really necessarily give a lot of thought to. But it's a lot easier to manage things when they pop up if you've done some groundwork already. So if we've set up the policies, if we've had some communication with people, if we know what the expectations are around behaviours, and then we're able to actually police those and make some informed decisions about them. That's not to say that if you do have a crisis that pops up that you can't do anything about it. Of course you can, but it would have been easier to handle and probably faster to handle if you had some of this stuff in place beforehand. So like most things in life, if we spend some time up front, we can save lots of time, resources and hassle down the track. So setting this stuff up before there's an issue, and I think anyone who attended the session that we ran earlier this year on recruitment would have got a very similar message to this. You know, the worst time to start writing interview guides and job ads and things for a role is when you actually have a vacancy. You need to have done that work prior to, so that you can roll it out quickly and get on with the job that you've actually got here. And the other HR policies and processes that we've been talking about are a bit the same. So we need to get them set up beforehand before we can actually expect them to just work for us. It is a bit of a legal area. So, and obviously we're HR specialists, we're not employment lawyers. So we look at things from a hands-on, nuts and bolts, what can we do in your business kind of perspective. But we're also very open with our clients when we get to the point where they actually need a legal opinion. If they're in a sticky situation with something and we really think that there's a bit of a risk there to the business, we'll be very open at saying that to people and offering to pass them on to a qualified employment lawyer at that particular point in time. Having said that, the local employment lawyer that we do a lot of work with has referred a lot of work to us as well, because he gets things that really a HR professional could deal with a lot quicker and a lot simpler than he could. So it's a really symbiotic relationship, I suppose, between the two. So that's what I wanted to cover today on just a little bit of an overview on HR essentials. So why is it important? Why is HR something that you probably do need to think about in your business? If you've got one staff member or 1,000 staff members, Fair Work treats you the same. You've got the same obligations under legislation as any of the large employers who have whole HR departments to help them out. So small businesses with staff need some help. Some need more than others, and that largely depends on the size of the business. We work with any size business, so people who are a micro business with one staff member to say sort of 6 or 7, they tend to be an ad hoc client, so they just get help as and when they need it. And once you kind of hit 10 to say 15, 20 staff is when you start to have a look at that HR plan sort of process, so we can get ahead of the game on some of this stuff rather than always playing catch up when there's an issue. I did, though, want to have some time here to open for Q&A, and the reason for this obviously is because there's been so many massive changes. There's been changes on the 9th of April this year to the Fair Work Act to introduce some COVID-19 clauses, and there's also been, you know, just lots of different things with JobSeeker, JobKeeper, and coronavirus in general. So I'll stop the share of the screen now and I'll unmute everyone. And if anyone has any particular questions, and my thinking here was really that that if people had questions around any of that stuff, we'd be more than happy to answer those today. So over to you guys.
I've got a question.
Great.
It's a bit of an odd one, but it comes back to what you were talking about, discrimination. You were saying you couldn't discriminate if someone had a lip or a lisp, but if they had hair colouring, etc., they were in control of it. Where do tattoos fit into that?
Good question.
Yeah, at least 1 in 7 Australians has a tattoo and growing. Where that comes in for me, and this is, I run into this quite often in organisations. So it comes back to what's reasonable for that particular organisation. So if it's somebody who's working somewhere where customers don't see them and, you know, they're kind of in the back room and all that kind of stuff, well, it doesn't really interfere with how their work is. But as I said before, I do a lot of work with retail pharmacies. Retail pharmacies have a lot of older clientele who have lots of, you know, preconceived ideas about that kind of thing. What do we do there? Well, we instruct the staff that they have to cover tattoos while at work. And if that means they choose to have tattoos on their forearms, they need to wear long sleeves. And if it's hot in summer, that's tough for them. You know, it's a reasonable management direction to say, you need you to cover up tattoos if it's potentially an issue for customers and or management. So it comes back to and so often these kind of questions do, Peter, come back to, is it a reasonable management directive or not? That's really what you've got to ask yourself. Is it reasonable in the situation? And asking someone to cover up is. I did have a girl in a pharmacy once who entered the Australian Miss Ink competition. So you can imagine what she looked like when she wore a nice cocktail dress or something. But when she was at work, she had long sleeve, she wore, you know, high neck things, and she wore opaque stockings. And you couldn't tell. And that was fine. She was able to do the job. It didn't mean she couldn't do the job, but we just needed to tell her what our expectation was and then police it, which is the important thing.
You know where my next question's going then?
Good.
What if it's up around here?
Well, what if it's up around here? Did they have it when they started the job?
Well, if you're interviewing for a job, you can tell people, yes, look, it's on your forms, cover up. But if it's actually visible, and a lot of people do have it, and look, don't worry, I'm not some old fuddy-duddy. I don't have them, but I've got plenty of daughters that do. I don't get it. But yeah, if it's visible, they can't cover that up, can they?
Yeah, look, it's there's certain, if you're a woman, there's certain makeups that you can use that cover. They're very thick. But the way I look at that, Peter, to be honest, is that's a life choice that somebody has made, and I respect that. That's their choice. Their choice has consequences.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Sure. Look at that. Everyone's all over the COVID-19 stuff. That's good. Terrific. Well, if there aren't any other questions, sorry?
I think Mildred had one, but I couldn't quite read it.
Okay. Was it on the chat?
Yeah, possibly. I think.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
That's all right, Mildred.
So, unlike everyone else, I'm actually in the United States. And I am an MBA student with a concentration in diversity and inclusion. I want to be able to have the presentation sent so that I could better understand the laws in Australia, so I can better understand future clients and employees.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, more than happy to send it to you. Tracy, we've got an email address for Mildred?
Yes, we do.
Terrific. Yeah.
Thank you kindly.
Pleasure. The key one for you, Mildred, is the Fair Work Act. It's massive here.
Work
so.
Act. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks for joining us, Mildred, from all that way. What time is it over there?
It is 7:38 in the evening.
Oh, that's not too bad.
That's not too bad. Yeah. No, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to join. I do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Pleasure. So we might leave it there for today if there aren't any other questions. Obviously, Carmel and I from the Proven Group are available you know, via phone or Zoom or whatever you would like. If you've got any questions around staff, how to handle any particular situations, we're always happy to talk to clients initially, and we don't charge for our initial phone calls and that kind of thing. So always happy to help out. And then if there's anything that people need, we have a chat to them about their specific situation. So thank you, everyone. I'll end the meeting there and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Belinda, thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.